Father David here. It's Sunday and time for your weekly sermon. So how do we know we've lined up our lives with God? What marks us as people of God? Today in the gospel lesson, the Pharisees are criticizing the disciples of Jesus because they're eating with unwashed hands. Different folks answer the question of how do we line up our lives with God? The Pharisees answer it by insisting on very strict purity rules that have them washing everything they eat with, hands and cups, pitchers and kettles, while condemning those who don't. Now, some of you moms might be thinking, what's wrong with clean hands? And of course, the answer is nothing, but this isn't about hygiene. Germs had not been discovered 2,000 years ago. It's about ritual. So the cleansing must be done just so, using the right amount of water, the right kind of water. The focus is on outer actions rather than inner intentions, which is something that leads many to equate the Pharisees with hypocrisy. But we can't dismiss them that easily. Like you and I, the Pharisees are complicated. They have good reasons for doing what they're doing. As you know, the Pharisees were lay people who took seriously God's command through Moses that the people of Israel are a holy people, just as God is holy. And like us, where God requires us to go an inch, we often think we must go a mile. So, for example, the Jewish law only required the priests to wash, and only before making sacrifices to God. Well, the Pharisees say that if we, as Moses says, are a nation of priests, then everyone should wash, and not just before a sacrifice, but before every meal. In a time when the people of Israel were occupied by Rome and inundated by Greek culture, the Pharisees are in many ways a commendable group, trying their hardest to keep and grow a distinctly Jewish identity among the people of Israel. This way they can remember who they are and who they are called to become, all in the face of massive cultural challenges. By washing, they mark themselves off as a people faithful to God, people deserving of God's blessing. This kind of thinking is quite common even today. While 2,000 years separate us from the Pharisees, we too are often fixated on purity. Except rather than purity, we call it having the right doctrine or following our traditions. Which is why we church-going Christians often need to take a really hard look at ourselves. We are usually morally upright and good citizens, as conventionally defined. But we are also, as a group, often slow to take on structures of economic and racial injustice. We tend to support the military, no matter what Jesus says about living and dying by the sword. And while we don't mind helping the needy, we kind of prefer helping just the deserving needy. And then there are other Christians who say that any obscenity can be overlooked in some political candidates as long as they are against abortion or gay rights, while still others try to collapse Christianity into a sort of Leave It to Beaver, family-friendly cult that waves flags of nationalism and is hostile to people of other places. Truth be told, each of us, sometimes quietly and sometimes quite loudly, are sure that it is we and not them who are on the right side with God. We are, we whisper silently to ourselves, a bit cleaner than all the rest of them. And all of which is a reminder that modern Christianity shouldn't sneer too loudly at these Pharisees. Of course, the truth is we do need traditions and rules and doctrines. Without these, there's no skin to hold the wine of our faith. Without these, we can't know who we are. The problem isn't the traditions or the doctrines or the rules in and of themselves. The problems come when we, like the Pharisees, substitute traditions and rules for the wild, unpredictable, challenging, merciful, cajoling, forgiving, insistent, pregnant Spirit of the living God. We forget to our peril that God isn't interested in turning us into obedient robots. Instead, God is always calling us up and out of who we think we are. God isn't crazy about the traditions we create and so carefully protect, because when we draw lines, we separate ourselves from each other. Good from bad, wheat from chaff, good fish from bad. But God is a God who loves the good and the bad. Because when we see the good and bad through the eyes of God, we're forced to acknowledge that it is all hopelessly intertwined, enmeshed, inseparable, which is why, thanks be to God, untamed grace keeps pouring out into alien territory. Jesus has a message for the outraged Pharisees today, and he has a message for us as well. If you think your rules and doctrines or traditions sum up the substance of the living God, then your God is too small. Because once we come to glimpse the unending yearning that God has for all of creation, we begin to understand why Jesus, in mercy, crosses every barrier that separates us. It's why he eats with prostitutes and tax collectors and Roman collaborators. He's not in it for the purity. He's in it to show us that if you follow Jesus, you're going to get dirty. Roy Pearson says, the church is like a chimney sweep. It can't do its job with clean hands. And so cleanliness is not next to godliness. Dirt is. Dirt, pain, sorrow, prejudice, injustice, treachery. These and so much more await the follower of Jesus. We are constantly called by Jesus out of our easy chairs and onto the hard wooden benches where our impoverished neighbors sit, our friends of different faiths, our children whose sexual orientation may be different than ours. What Jesus seems to be getting at today is that we will find him just as often in the graffiti-littered, urine-soaked bus stop as in the rose-scented sweet smell of church pews. Jesus meets us wherever we are. I learned this week that the literal translation for the word unclean that we hear in today's gospel doesn't actually mean dirty or impure. It actually means ordinary, common, which means the Pharisees' concern is about separating the holy from the ordinary. Religious people in every era seem fixated on doing exactly that same thing. We find it so hard to believe that the holy is perfectly comfortable here in the midst of the ordinary. And yet religious people of every stripe are convinced that the ordinary contaminates the holy. It's an outside-in way of thinking. It's a way of thinking that has us see outsiders, those who are not like us, as dangerous or evil or a threat. Just take a gander at the hysteria concerning our borders, as long-suffering Central Americans are simply seeking a better life. But Jesus comes to show us that God dances precisely with the ordinary. For Jesus, the holy cannot be contaminated by the ordinary. In fact, the opposite is true. The holy contaminates the ordinary, like yeast in flour, like seeds planted, like the Word becoming flesh. making all that is ordinary holy. This is an inside-out way of living, where the power of God distributes undeserved grace and unconditional love, freely, wildly, recklessly. Remember the story of Babette's Feast? It was a film about a woman from Paris who won a fortune in the lottery and who spent every penny of that fortune on this fabulous feast for a group of old nuns whose traditions nearly strangled them to death. And the story concluded with these words: people in their weakness and short-sightedness believe they must make all sorts of choices in this life, and they tremble at the risks they think they are taking. But our choices of this and that don't really matter very much. The time will come when our eyes will be opened, and we shall see that mercy is infinite. We only need wait for it, confidently, hopefully, and then receive it with gratitude. Mercy imposes no conditions. Everything we hope for is already granted. Even everything we rejected is waiting for us. Yes, we receive that which we even once rejected. For mercy and truth shall meet, righteousness and bliss shall kiss. God bless you.